By the end of the 1870s, one company controlled roughly 90% of the oil refined in the United States. Not 90% of a city. Not 90% of a market. 90% of the light, because in that world, refined oil meant kerosene, and kerosene was what stood between ordinary families and the dark. The company was Standard Oil. The man behind it was a quiet Baptist bookkeeper from Cleveland named John D. Rockefeller, a man who never shouted, rarely explained himself, wrote down every cent he ever touched, and built, before his 40th birthday, the most complete private monopoly the modern world has ever seen. It took the United States 40 years to bring him down. In May 1911, the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil shattered into 34 separate companies, the biggest forced breakup in business history. And then came the twist that still makes economists wince. The breakup made him richer. Within about 2 years, the pieces were worth roughly double what the whole had been, and Rockefeller's fortune swelled toward $900 million, in the region of 2% of the entire American economy. The punishment was the payday. This is the story of how one man came to own American oil, the bet on refining when everyone else was drilling, the secret railroad deals that armed the machine, the 6 weeks in which he swallowed an entire city's industry, the legal invention that gave the English language the word antitrust, and the daughter of a man he ruined, who sat down with a filing cabinet full of documents and did what Congress, the courts, and 3 presidents could not. Because this is not really a story about oil. It is a story about scale, what it builds, what it crushes, and what happens when a country finally decides it has had enough. Start with the man, because the machine is unimaginable without him. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in upstate New York, the son of 2 people who might have been designed as opposites. His father, William Big Bill, was a traveling peddler of quack medicines, a charming confidence man who vanished for months at a time, and by one neighbor's recollection, boasted that he cheated his own sons at every chance to make them sharp. His mother, Eliza, was a devout Baptist who raised the children on thrift, scripture, and silence about their father. From one parent, John learned how money is taken. From the other, he learned how it is kept. He spent the rest of his life keeping it. At 16, in September 1855, after weeks of walking Cleveland's business district in the summer heat and being turned away door after door, he was hired as an assistant bookkeeper at a produce shipping firm. For the rest of his life, through the monopoly, the billions, the infamy, he celebrated the anniversary of that hiring as job day with more feeling than his own birthday. He bought a small red notebook, called it Ledger A, and recorded everything. Every cent earned, every cent spent, every cent given to the church. He kept that ledger like a relic until he died. It is the whole man in one object, a person for whom the numbers were never a means to the money. The numbers were the point. Then, in August 1859, in the hills of western Pennsylvania, a former railway conductor named Edwin Drake drilled a hole about 70 feet deep and struck oil, and the numbers went insane. What followed was one of the great manias of the century. Farmland that had been worthless sold for fortunes. Boomtowns appeared in months and vanished in a few years. And the price of crude oil swung like a hanged rope, from around $10 a barrel at moments of scarcity to mere cents at moments of glut, because there was no way to control how much came out of the ground. Every new gusher made every existing well less valuable. Drilling was not a business. It was a lottery in which winning the jackpot lowered the jackpot. Rockefeller, by then a young commission merchant in Cleveland, looked at the frenzy and saw what almost nobody else saw. The money was not in the hole in the ground. Whoever pumped it, all of that unstable, chaotic crude had to pass through one narrow gate on its way to the world's lamps, the refinery. Crude prices gyrated wildly. The margin for turning crude into kerosene was steadier, and for a disciplined operator, controllable. So in 1863, He put his money into a Cleveland refinery, and in February 1865, at the age of 25, he bid $72,500 at auction to buy out his own senior partners and take control. He later called it the day that determined his career. The oil rush was 3,000 men digging for gold. Rockefeller had quietly bought the assay office. And then he did something that sounds boring and was actually the foundation of everything. He ran the refinery properly. Nobody else did. Refining in the 1860s was a slapdash trade of leaky barrels, wasted byproducts, and casual bookkeeping. Rockefeller attacked waste the way other men attacked competitors. When barrels were expensive, Standard built its own barrel works and bought its own timber, kiln drying the wood first, because dry wood was lighter and cheaper to haul, and cut the cost of a barrel by more than half. He hired his own plumbers. He found buyers or uses for the byproducts other refiners dumped. In his old age, he loved to tell the story of watching a machine solder cans of kerosene with 40 drops of solder and asking whether it could be done with 38. 38 leaked, 39 held. Standard used 39 drops multiplied by millions of cans. The company's very name was the sales pitch. In an age when badly refined kerosene could flare and set houses ablaze, Standard Oil promised a standard product, every gallon, every time. In January 1870, he folded the operation into a new corporation, the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, capitalized at $1 million, with Rockefeller holding the largest stake. At that moment, it controlled roughly 1/10 of American refining. 1/10. Hold that number, because within about 9 years it becomes 9/10. And the way that happens is the reason this company ends up in front of the Supreme Court. Now watch the machine, because its real fuel was never oil. It was freight. Everything Standard shipped crude in, kerosene out, moved by rail. And the railroads of the 1870s were locked in ruinous rate wars, desperate for one thing above all: steady, predictable volume. Rockefeller's partner Henry Flagler, who would later take his Standard fortune and build modern Florida, understood the trade perfectly. Standard could promise the railroads what no one else could: a guaranteed, enormous, regular flow of barrels, by some accounts 60 carloads a day, evenly loaded, no surprises. In exchange, the railroads quietly handed back a slice of the published freight rate. A rebate. Feel the geometry of that. The discount lowered Standard's costs. Lower costs meant Standard could sell cheaper and grow. Growth meant more volume. More volume meant a bigger discount. Every turn of the wheel powered the next turn. Rockefeller's rivals were not competing against a better refiner. They were competing against a flywheel and paying full price for the privilege. Rebates were secret, resented, and in the 1870s, not clearly illegal. What came next was something else entirely. In early 1872, a scheme took shape under a deliberately forgettable name: the South Improvement Company. On paper, it was a Pennsylvania shell with vague powers. In substance, it was a private treaty between the major railroads and a ring of large refiners, Standard chief among them. The published freight rates on oil would roughly double. Members of the ring would get huge rebates off those inflated rates. And then came the clause that people at the time could barely believe when it leaked: the drawback. For oil shipped by refiners outside the ring, a portion of the freight charge would be paid over to the ring. Read that again slowly. Every barrel a competitor shipped would generate cash for Standard Oil. Your rival's business becomes your revenue. And as a bonus, the railroads would share the way-bills, so the ring could see exactly who was shipping what to whom, at what price. It was, even by the freewheeling standards of the Gilded Age, breathtaking. One contemporary in the oil country called the scheme an anaconda, and the name stuck. Because the scheme leaked. In February 1872, word reached the oil regions of Pennsylvania, the drillers, The small refiners, the towns that lived on crude, and the region simply erupted. Thousands of producers packed into torchlit meetings. They organized a union, embargoed every member of the ring, and shut off the crude. Newspapers printed the members' names like a wanted list. Petitions poured into Harrisburg and Washington. A congressional committee took up the affair, and by April, the Pennsylvania legislature had revoked the company's charter. The South Improvement Company died without ever shipping a single barrel under its contracts. On paper, Rockefeller had been rooted, and this is where the story turns cold. Because while the scheme was collapsing in public, Rockefeller had already used it in private. Put yourself behind the desk of a Cleveland refiner in those same weeks, February and March of 1872. The rumors say the railroads have signed with a secret ring. The published rates are about to double. Your margins, thin already, are about to vanish. And then John D. Rockefeller comes to call, soft-spoken, patient, unfailingly polite, and offers to buy your refinery. He opens Standard's books and shows you his costs, which are lower than yours will ever be. He offers you cash, or, if you are wise, stock in Standard Oil. One rival later recalled him saying in that gentle voice that he had ways of making money that others knew nothing of. You can fight against a competitor whose freight costs you cannot see, backed by railroads you depend on. Or you can sell. They sold. In about 6 weeks, Standard Oil absorbed some 22 of the 26 refineries in Cleveland. History remembers it as the Cleveland Massacre, a massacre in which no shot was fired and every victim signed the paperwork. Many sellers went to their graves swearing they had been robbed, paid a fraction of what their works had cost to build. Rockefeller answered, with perfect actuarial calm, that most of those refineries were obsolete junk in a dying margin, and that he had paid fairly for assets whose real value was collapsing. The bitter irony is that both things were true, and that the handful of sellers who took stock instead of cash became, in time, some of the wealthiest families in America. Cleveland was the template and Standard ran it across the country. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, the oil regions themselves. Buy the best rivals, close the worst, keep the deals secret. Some acquired firms kept their old names for years, competing theatrically with a parent the public did not know they had. Standard built its own fleets of tank cars, bought terminals, pushed into pipelines. And when an upstart called Tidewater built a daring long-distance pipeline over the mountains in 1879 to escape the railroads entirely, Standard answered by building its own lines and eventually coming to terms. Control the refining, then control the roads to the refining, then control the roads from it. By around 1879, the number was reached. Roughly 90% of American refining capacity answered, one way or another, to Standard Oil. American kerosene lit lamps from Ohio to Asia, and most of it passed through one company's hands. And here is the uncomfortable truth that the villain version of this story always skips: the customer one. Through the 1870s, the price of kerosene collapsed from roughly 26 cents a gallon at the start of the decade to single digits within about 10 years, and quality rose. Light, real light after sunset, stopped being a luxury. That fall in price is Standard's entire defense, and it is not nothing. Rockefeller went to his grave believing he had rescued a suicidal industry from chaos and given the poor man cheap light. He once wrote that Standard was refining oil for the poor man, and he must have it cheap and good. The question the next 40 years of this story asks is whether it matters how the price fell, whether a low price paid at the counter excuses what happened behind it. But first, Standard had a problem, and it was not moral, it was mechanical. Under the law of the age, owning 90% of an industry was, strictly speaking, impossible. An Ohio corporation in that era could not simply own shares in corporations chartered in other states. Standard's empire, dozens of nominally separate companies across the map, was held together by handshakes, trusteeships, and quiet understandings, a legal haze that would not survive serious scrutiny. The empire existed. The law had no container for it. So Standard's lawyer built one. His name was Samuel C.T. Dodd, and history has a taste for irony, because Dodd was an oil country lawyer from the region Standard had steamrolled, a man who had once denounced railroad discrimination in his youth. Now, as Standard's counsel, he reached back to one of the oldest instruments in English law, the trust, the humble device by which property is held for widows and orphans, and scaled it to the size of an empire. In January 1882, the shareholders of Standard Oil and its constellation of companies, around 40 of them, handed their shares to a board of 9 trustees, Rockefeller at the head, receiving trust certificates in exchange. The trustees now controlled everything, everywhere as one machine, while the corporate law books showed only separate companies in separate states, each innocently local. Dodd, famously, refused to own a share of it. He took his salary and nothing else, insisting a lawyer's advice should never be colored by his holdings. He then spent years explaining to legislatures that the colossus he had personally designed was nothing sinister. The invention spread like a patent everyone could steal. Within a few years there was a sugar trust, a whiskey trust, a lead trust, a cottonseed oil trust. The word trust, Dodd's word, the widows and orphans' word, became America's word for monopoly itself. Farmers cursed it, cartoonists drew it as an octopus, and in 1890 Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, Antitrust, a law aimed, in its very name, at the structure Samuel Dodd had drawn up for John D. Rockefeller. Standard Oil was now the named enemy of an entire body of American law. Remember that law. It takes 21 years to land. The first blow came from Ohio, whose Supreme Court ruled in 1892 that the trust violated the terms of Standard of Ohio's charter and ordered the arrangement wound up. Standard responded the way water responds to a rock. It slow-walked the dissolution for years, and then found a better container. New Jersey, hungry for incorporation fees, had rewritten its laws to let one corporation own shares in others. The holding company, made legal at last. In 1899, the whole empire reformed as Standard Oil of New Jersey, everything under one roof, this time in broad daylight. The trust was dead. The monopoly had simply changed clothes. And its creator walked away. By 1897, Rockefeller, still in his 50s, had quietly withdrawn from day-to-day management, leaving the machine to lieutenants. He played golf. He gave away money on a scale no one had ever attempted. He was the richest man in the world. His company was untouchable, and the century was turning in his favor. He had no idea that the most dangerous enemy of his life was a schoolteacher's salary journalist at a monthly magazine, and that he had made her an enemy himself 30 years earlier, when she was 14 years old. Go back to 1872, to the oil regions, to the winter of the South Improvement Company. In a house near Titusville lived a tank builder and small producer named Franklin Tarbell, one of the men who packed those torchlit meetings, one of the thousands who embargoed the ring. His daughter Ida watched her father come home changed that winter. The open, confident world of the oil country replaced by something guarded and bitter. The family's fortunes were bruised in the long Standard years that followed. Later, her father's business partner, crushed by debt in the losing fight against the machine, took his own life, and Franklin Tarbell mortgaged the family home to cover the firm's obligations. Ida Tarbell carried all of it out of the oil country with her, not as rage, but as a question she spent decades learning how to ask properly. She was, by any measure, formidable. One of the only women in her college class, a school teacher, then a writer in Paris living on magazine work, then one of the star journalists at McClure's magazine, where her serialized lives of Napoleon and Lincoln had made her a national name. Around the turn of the century, McClures went looking for a way to write about the trusts, the defining economic fact of the age, and settled on telling the story of one, the mother of them all, Standard Oil. The writer they chose was the daughter of the oil regions. What she did next is the second hinge of this story, and the reason it ends the way it does. She did not write an attack. She wrote an audit. Standard Oil had spent 30 years being investigated, sued and subpoenaed state courts, federal committees, the Ohio litigation, the endless rate cases, and each proceeding had deposited testimony, contracts, and exhibits into the public record like sediment. Nobody had ever read it all. Tarbell read it all. For years, she and her researcher worked through the accumulated paper of 3 decades, cross-checking rumor against sworn testimony. She even interviewed a sitting lord of the company itself, Henry H. Rogers, one of Standard's most feared executives, the introduction arranged through his friend Mark Twain, who sat with her repeatedly, urbane and candid, apparently confident the company's story would charm on the record. It did not. The history of the Standard Oil Company began running in McClures in November 1902 and stretched to 19 installments before it became a book in 1904. It reconstructed everything you have heard in this video: the rebates, the drawbacks, the South Improvement contracts, the Cleveland Winter of 1872, not as accusation but as documentation, chapter after chapter of receipts. And it was devastating precisely because Tarbell refused to make it simple. She wrote openly of her admiration for the machine, its efficiency, its discipline, its genius. Her verdict when it came was all the harder for it, that the men of Standard Oil had never played fair, and that this ruined their greatness for her. The country read it, and the country's mood turned. This was the era the president himself, Theodore Roosevelt, half-mockingly christened the age of the muckrakers, and Tarbell's series was its masterpiece. The moment investigative journalism proved it could put a fact pattern in front of the public that no institution could wave away. Rockefeller never answered her in public. In private, it was said, he called her Miss Tarbell. He might have done better to read the footnotes, because a government with an election-winning appetite for trust-busting now had, laid out in 19 installments, something very close to a case file. In November 1906, the Roosevelt administration filed suit in federal court to dissolve Standard Oil of New Jersey under the Sherman Act. The proceeding was gigantic, testimony from hundreds of witnesses assembled into a record running to thousands of pages. The corporate anatomy of the empire dissected transaction by transaction, decades of rebates and acquisitions dragged into the light. Standard fought every inch up through the circuit court, all the way to the top. And on the 15th of May, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States delivered its judgment. Standard Oil was an unreasonable restraint of trade, and it would be dissolved. The holding company had 6 months to let go of everything, 34 separate companies, cut loose to compete with one another. The greatest industrial empire on earth had been broken by the state. The newspapers reached for the language of revolutions. And the man himself, Rockefeller, long retired, was on the golf course when word arrived, and by one well-worn account, he turned to the priest he was playing with and offered him the best financial advice of the century: buy Standard Oil. Whether or not he said it, it was the correct call, and here is the mechanism because it matters. For years, Standard had been a black box, secretive, hated, legally besieged, its shares traded on trust and fear. The dissolution forced the box open. 34 companies now stood in daylight, each with its own books, and investors could finally see what had been inside: pipelines, refineries, oil fields, tank fleets, marketing networks, assets the market had never properly priced. And each existing shareholder received shares in all of them, in proportion. Within about 2 years, the combined value of the fragments had roughly doubled. Rockefeller, who still held around a quarter of it all, watched the government's punishment carry his fortune toward $900 million, by common reckoning around 2% of the American economy of the day, a share of national wealth no private person has approached since. The Supreme Court had made him the richest man in modern history. And the timing turned the irony into farce. Standard's actual monopoly had already been eroding for a decade. The great Texas gushers after 1901 had raised rivals like Gulf and Texaco beyond its reach, and electric light was coming for kerosene, the product the whole empire had been built to sell. But just as the old business dimmed, a new machine arrived to drink what Standard had once burned off as waste: the automobile. Gasoline demand exploded in the very years the fragments went free, and the fragments rode it. Their names tell you how that went. Standard of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard of New York became Mobil. Standard of California became Chevron. Standard of Indiana became Amoco. Standard of Ohio ended up inside BP. And in 1999, two of the largest fragments, Exxon and Mobil, merged back together, reassembling a piece of the old trust under one roof, with regulators' blessing 88 years after the court had cut it apart. Rockefeller spent his last decades giving the fortune away, and even his giving was industrial. More than $500 million deployed with the same system he had brought to refining. A great university built in Chicago, Medical Research Institutes, a foundation chartered in 1913, campaigns that helped drive hookworm out of the American South. The man vilified as the octopus quietly became one of the founders of modern public health, and by many measures, the greatest philanthropist of his era, handing shiny dimes to strangers while his money rewired medicine. When the financial system itself nearly died in the panic of 1907, it was Rockefeller who deposited $10 million to steady the banks and pledged half his fortune to hold America's credit, a story we tell elsewhere on this channel. He died in 1937, at 97, within reach of a goal he had held for decades, to live to 100 on a fortune built from light. So what does the story of Standard Oil actually teach? The machinery version, not the morality play. First, monopolies are built on boring things, not genius products, freight rates, solder drops, barrel timber, cost sheets. Standard did not out-invent anyone. It out-counted everyone, and then used its size to buy advantages, the rebates, the drawbacks that no efficiency could match. That is the permanent trick of scale. It starts as a reward for being better and quietly becomes a weapon for staying biggest. The customer's price can fall the entire time. Both of Standard's truths were true at once: cheaper light for everyone, and a locked door for anyone who tried to compete. Every monopoly since has offered the same trade, and every regulator since has had to decide whether the price at the counter settles the question. Second, the paper wins in the end. Standard was not brought down by a rival, a strike, or a crash. It was brought down by its own documents, 30 years of contracts and sworn testimony, read in full at last by the one person with the patience and the personal reason to read them. Ida Tarbell invented the method that watchdogs of every kind still use: skip the adjectives, assemble the record. Institutions that cannot survive their own paper trail are living on borrowed time. And third, breakups are not death sentences. Sometimes they are the opposite. The pieces of Standard Oil were worth more apart than together, grew faster apart than together, and some of them eventually re-merged anyway. Which is worth remembering today, whenever the question returns, as it has returned loudly, in our own age of platforms that deliver lower prices while owning the road every rival must travel. The argument you hear about those companies is, almost word for word, the argument of 1911. We have run this experiment before. The empire was broken, the shareholders got richer, the industry grew, and the fight over what scale is allowed to do simply moved on to the next machine. Rockefeller built the machine of the age and was punished into history's largest fortune. But 4 years before the court broke his trust, the entire American financial system nearly collapsed in 3 weeks, and the man who single-handedly stopped it wasn't Rockefeller. It was a 70-year-old banker with a famous temper, working out of his own private library. That is the story of the Panic of 1907, and we have told it. Sources for this account include the records and opinions of the federal antitrust case against Standard Oil of New Jersey and the Supreme Court's 1911 decision, the published contracts and congressional testimony surrounding the South Improvement Company, Ida Tarbell's history of the Standard Oil Company and her memoirs, Rockefeller's own published reminiscences and correspondence, contemporary reporting from the oil region's press, and the major documented biographies drawing on the Rockefeller archives. In October 1907, the United States of America, the fastest-growing economy on Earth, nearly died of a heart attack. Banks collapsed by the dozen. The stock market lost half its value. Depositors stood in lines around city blocks, in the rain, waiting to pull out savings that in many cases no longer existed. And the strangest part of the whole affair is who stopped it. Not the government. The government had no tool to stop it. There was no Federal Reserve, no deposit insurance, no lender of last resort. In the world's rising industrial power, the machinery for rescuing the financial system did not exist. What America had instead was one man, a 70-year-old banker with a famous temper, a swollen nose, and more personal authority than the President of the United States. For 3 weeks, John Pierpont Morgan ran the American financial system out of his private library on Madison Avenue, deciding, bank by bank, night by night, who would live and who would die. This is the story of the Panic of 1907, the failed corner on a copper stock that lit the fuse, the chain of dominoes nobody could stop, the night the bankers were locked in a library until they signed, and the uncomfortable question the whole affair left behind. Because when it was over, America looked at what had happened and asked, what happens next time when there is no Morgan? The answer to that question is the Federal Reserve. This is the crash that created it. To understand 1907, you first have to understand how fragile the American banking system was, by design. And understand first that panic was not a stranger in America. It was practically a season. The country's financial history ran on a grim rhythm, a shattering panic roughly every 20 years, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, each one following the same score. A boom, a failure somewhere unexpected, a scramble for cash, banks falling like wet paper, then years of depression to pay for it. The Panic of 1893 was still a living memory in 1907. Men in the Knickerbockers queue had stood in queues before, as children, holding their fathers' hands. Americans did not run on their banks because they were foolish. They ran because running early was the only lesson their history had ever taught them. In a system with no safety net, panic was not irrational. It was experience. America at the turn of the century had thousands of banks and almost no system. Each bank stood alone, holding its own reserves, backed by nobody. There was no central bank. Americans had killed theirs twice, in fits of democratic suspicion, and for 70 years the world's most dynamic economy had run without one. When a bank ran short of cash, it borrowed from other banks, and when everyone ran short at once, there was nowhere to borrow at all. And layered on top of the banks was something newer and looser, the trust companies. Trusts had begun as sleepy institutions managing estates and inheritances. But by 1907, they had discovered a profitable loophole. They could take deposits like banks while holding a fraction of the reserves banks kept, and lend the difference into the stock market. In a decade, the trusts of New York had grown to rival the banks themselves. They were, in the language of a later century, a shadow banking system, bank-sized risks without bank-grade cushions. All of it, banks, trusts, brokers, the exchange itself, ran on the same thin fuel, confidence. And in October of 1907, confidence met a match. The match was lit, absurdly enough, by a mining speculator with a mustache and a grudge. Fritz Augustus Heinz had made a fortune in Montana copper and come to New York to become a financier. In October 1907, he and an associate named Charles Morse attempted one of the oldest plays in the book, a corner on the stock of United Copper, buying enough of the company to trap the short sellers and squeeze them for ransom. The corner failed. United Copper stock, driven briefly to $60, collapsed to $10 in 2 days. Heinz was ruined, and that should have been the end of the story. A speculator gambled, a speculator lost. But Heinz was not just a speculator. He was also the president of a bank. And his partner Morse sat on the boards of half a dozen more. Within hours, depositors began asking the obvious question: if the man who runs my bank has just lost everything, is my money still there? By the 17th of October, the run had started. The Mercantile National Bank, Heinz Bank, was besieged. The Clearing House, the bankers' private club that settled accounts between banks, stepped in and forced Heinz and Morse out of banking entirely. It was meant to reassure. It did the opposite. If those men were rotten, depositors reasoned who else was. The panic found its answer on Monday the 21st, and the answer was enormous. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, the third largest trust in New York, marble-columned, 18,000 depositors, $65 million. Its president, Charles Barney, was rumored to have been entangled with Morse's schemes. The rumor was enough. That afternoon, the National Bank of Commerce announced it would no longer clear the Knickerbockers' checks. That announcement was a death sentence, and everyone in New York knew how to read it. The next morning, the 22nd of October, the Knickerbockers' Grand Marble Hall on Fifth Avenue filled with depositors demanding cash. In under 3 hours, $8 million went out over the counters. Shortly after noon, the trust suspended payments and closed its doors. The third largest trust in America was gone before lunch. The human wreckage was immediate. Charles Barney, the Knickerbockers' president, a man who weeks earlier had commanded one of the grandest institutions in New York, was ruined socially and financially by the collapse. Within weeks, he was dead by his own hand, and the newspapers turned his fate into the panic's grim emblem. The two men who had lit the fuse fared according to their luck rather than their guilt. Charles Morse was convicted and imprisoned, then released after an elaborate medical deception that fooled the President of the United States into a pardon. Augustus Heinz fought his charges for years and walked free. The panic punished institutions efficiently and men almost at random, a pattern every crash in this series repeats. And now the fire jumped the street. If the Knickerbocker could die, no trust in New York was safe. By nightfall, lines were forming outside the Trust Company of America, the city's second largest. The panic had found the shadow banking system, and the shadow banking system had no fire brigade, no clearing house, no lender of last resort. And beyond New York, something stranger was happening. America began to run out of money itself, not wealth, physical cash. Frightened banks across the country hoarded every dollar. Frightened depositors stuffed what they withdrew into mattresses and safe deposit boxes. Currency simply vanished from circulation, and for a premium you could literally buy cash, pay $104 by check for $100 in bills. So the country improvised its own money. Clearing houses in 2/3 of American cities began printing certificates, emergency script that passed from hand to hand in place of dollars. Factories paid wages in it, shops accepted it. By some estimates, $500 million of this makeshift currency circulated that winter, unofficial, technically questionable, and absolutely necessary. The world's largest economy spent months running on money it had invented for itself, town by town, because the real thing was hiding under mattresses. Keep that image, a modern nation printing emergency money in its city basements, because it is the exact problem the end of this story was built to solve. What it had, what the entire United States had, was the old man in the library. The library itself deserves a moment, because it was the crisis's true headquarters and its theater. Morgan had built it beside his brownstone on Madison Avenue, a Renaissance palazzo in marble, lined with Gutenberg Bibles, medieval manuscripts, and old master drawings, presided over by his brilliant young librarian, Belle de Costa Green. For 3 weeks in the autumn of 1907, this temple of beauty became the operations room of American finance. Bankers conferring under Renaissance ceilings, auditors' figures spread across manuscript tables, reporters camped on the marble steps reading the crisis in which windows stayed lit. The symbolism escaped no one then, and should escape no one now. The United States was being rescued not from a government building, but from one man's private collection. John Pierpont Morgan was 70 years old in October 1907, half retired, and the single most powerful private citizen in the world. His bank sat at the center of American finance. His word could move markets. His glare, by every account that survives, could stop them. When the panic broke, Morgan was at a church convention in Virginia. He returned to New York by private rail car on the night of the 19th, and the whole of Wall Street exhaled at the news. What Morgan did next was, in effect, to become the Federal Reserve, alone, unelected, and armed with nothing but other people's money and his own force of will. First, information. He sent teams of young auditors into the tottering trusts overnight, with orders to answer a single question: is this institution broke or merely frightened? It is the central question of every financial panic, the difference between insolvency and illiquidity, between a dead bank and a healthy one being strangled. And Morgan understood, as few men of his age did, that the entire rescue turned on telling them apart. The Knickerbocker, his men reported, was too far gone. Morgan let it die. The Trust Company of America, they reported, was solvent, frightened, besieged, but sound. And on that verdict, Morgan made the decision that defined the panic. This, then, he said, is the place to stop the trouble. The rescue that followed ran for 3 weeks, and it ran like a military campaign fought with checkbooks. Morgan summoned the presidents of the great banks to his library and extracted pledges, millions upon millions in loans to the besieged trusts. The Treasury Secretary, George Cortelyou, came to New York in person and deposited $35 million of federal money into the banks, and, in doing so, quietly admitted the government's own helplessness. After that, Washington had nothing left, and the rescue belonged entirely to private citizens. And the private citizens came because Morgan asked. John D. Rockefeller, the richest man alive, and no friend of Morgan's, deposited $10 million with the besieged trusts and told the press he would give half of everything he owned to keep America's credit standing. John D. Rockefeller, pledging half his fortune, on the record, to calm a bank queue. That is what a lender of last resort looks like when a country has to improvise one out of rich men and telephones. Even the churches were enlisted. With the crisis running into a weekend, Morgan asked the clergy of New York to preach calm from their Sunday pulpits, and they did. Nothing better captures 1907, the financial system of the United States being held together, hour by hour, with borrowed money, borrowed authority, and borrowed faith. When the stock exchange itself began to fail on the 24th call money, the overnight loans that financed every trade, simply unavailable at any price. The exchange's president walked across the street to Morgan's office and told him the market could not stay open. Morgan gave him an order. The exchange would not close 1 minute before its normal hour. Then he raised $23 million before 2 o'clock, and the market lived out the day. He did it again the next day with another $10 million. Legend says he ordered the money lent at 10%, and the trading floor cheered him. He saved the city of New York itself in the same style. The city was days from defaulting on its payroll. Morgan bought $30 million of its bonds, more or less over a weekend. But hold that image of the selfless rescuer, because the panic's most controversial hour is coming, and it is the hour that makes Morgan human. In the first days of November, one more domino wobbled. A major brokerage stood to fail, and the collateral behind its loans was stock in the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, one of the few serious competitors to U.S. Steel. The colossus Morgan himself had assembled 6 years earlier. If the brokerage fell, the stock would be dumped, and the cascade would resume. Morgan's solution rescued the market and enriched his empire in a single stroke. U.S. Steel would simply buy Tennessee coal and iron. There was one obstacle: the antitrust laws, and the trust-busting president behind them. So 2 of Morgan's men boarded an overnight train to Washington and over breakfast put the deal to Theodore Roosevelt himself, without mentioning the price or quite how valuable the company's iron ranges were. Roosevelt, facing a national collapse, agreed not to object. The purchase went through at a price historians still describe as a fraction of the company's worth. The panic was contained, and the greatest antitrust president in American history had personally waved through the deal of the century for the very trust he was famous for fighting. Whether Morgan engineered the moment or merely seized it has been argued for 100 years. Either way, remember it. It decides how this story ends. And then, on the 2nd of November, came the night that gave the panic its legend. The crisis had one last fire. A major brokerage stood to fail on Monday, dragging the market down with it, unless the trust companies, the very institutions Morgan had been saving, put up a final $25 million. The trust presidents balked, so Morgan invited them to his library on Madison Avenue to discuss it, ushered them into the East Room among the Renaissance manuscripts, and locked the door. The key was in Morgan's pocket. The message required no explanation. Gentlemen, nobody sleeps until this is signed. Through the small hours, the trust presidents argued, calculated, and looked for exits that did not exist. At 4:45 in the morning, Morgan placed the agreement in front of the leader of the holdouts, put a pen in his hand, and said, "There the place, and here the pen." The paper was signed. The panic, in every way that mattered, was over. The aftermath came in 2 installments, one immediate, one historic. The immediate cost was a brutal year. The panic tipped the American economy into a sharp depression. Production fell by double digits, unemployment tripled, and the crash echoed through every country wired to New York by gold and cable. The system had been saved, but the economy had still paid the bill for its fragility. And the men who had watched Morgan work drew a darker conclusion than gratitude. If one private banker could decide, in a locked library, which institutions lived and which died, who had really been rescued, the country or the house of Morgan? That suspicion got its day in court. In 1912, Congress convened the Pujo Committee to investigate what the newspapers called the money trust, the theory that a small circle of Wall Street men controlled the arteries of American capital. Its climax was pure theater. Morgan himself, 75 years old, in the witness chair, cross-examined for 2 days. Asked whether money was the basis of credit, he gave the answer carved on his tombstone in every finance textbook since. "No, sir. The first thing is character." Before money or anything else, money cannot buy it. The committee's report counted the empire anyway. Morgan partners and their allies held hundreds of directorships across banks, railroads, and industry, influencing capital worth more than the assessed value of everything west of the Mississippi. The number shocked the country. Morgan, his family always insisted, was wounded by the ordeal. He sailed for Europe within weeks of testifying, declined through the winter, and died in Rome months later. The panic had made him a hero. The reckoning for the panic helped kill him. The historic installment was the question nobody could unask. The United States had survived 1907 because one 70-year-old man had chosen to save it, had possessed, in his single person, the information, the authority, and the nerve that the world's largest economy did not possess as a nation. Morgan was 70. Morgan would die, what then? Even Morgan's admirers understood the absurdity. A country of 90 million people could not run its financial system on the temper of one banker. Within months, Congress created a National Monetary Commission to study the disease. In 1910, its chairman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, traveled in deliberate secrecy, hunting cloves, false pretenses, a private railcar, to a resort island off the coast of Georgia, with a handful of New York bankers whose presence could never be admitted. On Jekyll Island, over 10 days, they drafted the blueprint of an American central bank. It took 3 more years of politics, renaming, and compromise. But in December 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, and the United States finally built the machine it had refused for a century. A permanent, institutional Morgan, a lender of last resort that would not die, retire, or lose its temper. Morgan himself never saw it. He died in Rome in the spring of 1913, 9 months before the act was signed. The markets he had personally carried through the panic marked his death the way nations mark the death of kings. The New York Stock Exchange stayed closed for 2 hours in his honor, an honor normally reserved for presidents. So what does 1907 teach, more than a century on? That a financial system built without a fire brigade will eventually meet a fire it cannot put out, and that the fire never starts where you expect. Not in the great banks, but in a failed copper corner and a half-regulated shadow system nobody thought to watch. That the decisive act in every panic is the same cold triage Morgan's auditors performed at midnight, sorting the merely frightened from the truly dead, and defending the first without mercy for the second. And that no economy, however mighty, can safely outsource its survival to the judgment of one man, however magnificent the library. The next time the American system faced a fire this size, in 1929, the machine Morgan inspired was finally standing, and it failed catastrophically anyway. But that is another story, and we have already told it. The machinery changes, the fire does not. Sources for this account include the records of the New York Clearing House, contemporary reporting from October and November 1907, the National Monetary Commission's published studies, and the accounts of participants in the library negotiations, including Benjamin Strong and Thomas Lamont. In the autumn of 1929, the richest country on earth watched its wealth evaporate in front of its own eyes, not slowly, over years of decline. In days and hours. On a single Tuesday in October, more money vanished from the New York Stock Exchange than the United States government had spent winning the First World War. They called it the Great Crash, and nearly a century later, it remains the measuring stick for every financial disaster that has followed. Every panic since has been compared to it. Every crash has been measured against it. 1929 is the one they all answer to. This is the story of how it happened, not the myth, the machinery. Because the crash of 1929 was not an act of God, and it was not bad luck. It was built, piece by piece, year by year, by ordinary people doing what seemed at the time entirely reasonable. And that is what makes it worth studying, because the machine they built has been rebuilt in different forms in every generation since. To understand the fall, you must first understand the climb, and the climb was extraordinary. The America of the 1920s was a country that believed it had solved the riddle of prosperity. The war was over, and America had won it, not just militarily but economically. Europe owed it money. The world bought its cars, its radios, its steel. Between 1922 and 1929, the output of American industry nearly doubled. Electricity reached the cities, then the towns. The Model T put the nation on wheels. The numbers tell the story. In August of 1921, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the great barometer of American business, stood at 63 points. By 1925, it had doubled. By 1927, it had doubled again. And then, in the last 2 years of the decade, the market did not climb. It levitated. By September of 1929, the Dow stood at 381 points, 6 times higher than it had been 8 years earlier. An entire generation came to believe that stocks simply went up, not usually, not mostly, always. There was a phrase for it, repeated in the newspapers, in the barber shops, on the trains: a new era. The rules of the past, it was said, no longer applied. Technology had changed everything. The radio, the automobile. The assembly line, this time it was different. Those 4 words, this time it's different, have preceded every financial disaster of the modern age. In 1929, an entire nation said them in unison. There had even been a dress rehearsal, if anyone had cared to watch it. A few years earlier, in the middle of the decade, America had staged a mania in miniature, the Florida land boom. Plots of swamp and scrubland changed hands sight unseen, bought not to build on but to resell, sometimes twice in the same week. Buyers put down 10% and flipped the paper. Prices doubled, doubled again, and then in 1926 the music stopped. A hurricane tore through Miami. The speculators vanished, and thousands of ordinary families discovered they owned expensive certificates to worthless mud. The lesson was written in plain English on the front pages: prices driven by borrowed money and the greater fool do not glide down. They collapse. The nation read the lesson, nodded, and moved its money to Wall Street. Because belief alone does not build a mania. For that, you need machinery, and the machinery of 1929 was a thing of terrible beauty. It was called buying on margin, and it worked like this. Suppose you wanted $1,000 of stock, but you had only 100. A broker would happily lend you the other 900, taking the shares themselves as security for the loan. If the stock rose 10%, you did not make 10%. You doubled your money. The gains on the borrowed shares were all yours. The trouble, of course, is that the arithmetic works both ways. If the stock fell 10%, you were not down 10%. You were wiped out. Your $100 was gone entirely. And if it fell further, the broker would issue the most dreaded demand in finance, the margin call. Put in more money immediately, or your shares would be sold at whatever price the market would give. Hold that mechanism in your mind, because it is the trigger of everything that follows. A market built on margin does not fall gently. When prices drop, margin calls force selling, and that selling drops prices further, which forces more margin calls, which force more selling. It is a loop. A machine that once started feeds itself. And the fuel kept coming. Brokers' loans paid handsome interest, so handsome that money flowed into Wall Street from everywhere. Corporations found they could earn more lending their spare cash to speculators than investing it in their own factories. Money arrived from London, from Paris, from banks across the American interior. All of it lent to people buying stocks with it, secured by the stocks themselves. By 1929, the total lent against stocks had passed $8.5 billion, more than the entire amount of currency then circulating in the United States. The market had become a tower of borrowed money, and everyone was standing at the top of it, admiring the view. Who was doing all this buying? By the end, almost everyone. It is the detail every account of 1929 agrees on, the mania's reach. Chauffeurs traded tips with their passengers. Waiters in Wall Street restaurants listened to lunch conversations and bought accordingly. The journalist Frederick Lewis Allen recorded that even the window cleaners of brokers' offices were pausing to watch the ticker. Brokerage houses opened branches in mid-sized towns and installed tickers on ocean liners so that no crossing of the Atlantic need interrupt a position. There is a story told by Joseph Kennedy, father of a future president, that he knew it was time to sell when a shoeshine boy began giving him stock advice. Whether or not the story is precisely true, the point of it was, when the last skeptic converts, there is no one left to buy. But the small buyers were not the drivers of this market. They were its passengers. The drivers were professionals, and what the professionals were doing in the late 20s would today be a criminal offense. They called them pools. A group of wealthy operators would quietly agree to run a stock. They would buy it among themselves, selling it back and forth to one another to create the appearance of furious activity on the ticker. The public, watching the tape, would see a stock waking up and pile in. The pool would feed shares out into the rising demand, then step away and let the price find its own level, far below where the public had bought. The most famous of them ran the stock of the Radio Corporation of America, the glamour technology share of the age. In a single week in March of 1928, a pool run through the broker Michael Meehan drove radio up by dozens of points and divided profits of nearly $5 million, at a time when a good annual wage was $1,500. None of this was illegal. There was no federal law against it. The stock exchange was a private club, and it regulated itself with all the vigor you would expect of a club whose members were getting rich. And above the pool stood something grander still, the holding companies and the investment trusts. Investment trusts, companies whose only business was owning shares of other companies, multiplied by the hundreds in the late 20s. In 1928 and 1929, they were being launched at the rate of roughly one every business day. Some trusts owned shares in other trusts, which owned shares in still others. Leverage stacked on leverage, a hall of mirrors with borrowed money at every reflection. In the utilities industry, one man, Samuel Insull of Chicago, sat atop a pyramid of holding companies so tangled that it was said no accountant in America fully understood it. Millions of ordinary investors own pieces of the pyramid. What they actually owned at the bottom of it all was less than anyone imagined. Even the banks had joined the game. The National City Bank of New York, ancestor of today's Citibank, had built a securities affiliate that sold stocks and bonds to the public through a sales force, the way other companies sold sewing machines. Its chairman, Charles Mitchell, was the great bull evangelist of the age, a man who believed and preached that the way to prosperity was to get the public into the market. His salesmen obliged, moving, among much else, bonds of South American governments that would shortly be worth very little. So stand back and look at the structure as it was in the summer of 1929. A public convinced that stocks only rise, a margin machine that multiplied every dollar of belief into $10 of buying. Pools painting the tape, Trusts stacked on trusts. Banks selling shares over the counter like groceries, and regulating all of it nobody. By that summer, the market was no longer connected to the businesses beneath it. Steel production was slowing. Car sales were falling. House building had been declining for 3 years. The economy, the real one, of factories and wages, had quietly turned down months before the market noticed. The tower was still rising, but the foundations had already begun to move. Not everyone believed, and the men who doubted are the most instructive characters in the whole story. The Federal Reserve had watched the tower grow with something close to paralysis. In the spring of 1929, it tried whispering official warnings about speculative credit, and the market ignored it. It nudged interest rates upward, and the money for brokers' loans simply flowed in from elsewhere, because no interest rate then imaginable could compete with a market rising 20% a year. The one central banker with the standing to act decisively, Benjamin Strong of the New York Fed, had died in 1928. His successors hesitated, caught between fear of feeding the bubble and fear of bursting it. In the end, they managed both. On the 5th of September 1929, an economist named Roger Babson stood before a business conference in Massachusetts and said what almost no one else would. Sooner or later, a crash is coming, and it may be terrific. The market fell 3% on his words alone. They called it the Babson break, and then, having flinched, it did what late-stage manias always do. It dismissed the warning, punished the messenger, and climbed on. Professional economists lined up to rebut him. One of the most famous, Irving Fisher of Yale, delivered the most unfortunate prediction in the history of the profession. Stocks, he said, had reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. He said it in mid-October 1929. The crash began within the week. And then there was the other kind of doubter, the kind who bets. Jesse Livermore had been trading since he was a boy of 14, chalking prices in a Boston brokerage. He had made and lost fortunes before. He had famously shorted the panic of 1907, and he had learned to read the machinery, the margin debt, the slowing economy, the frantic quality of the final climb. Through the autumn of 1929, quietly, methodically, spreading his orders across brokers so no one could see the whole position, he built one of the largest short bets ever assembled, a wager that the entire glittering edifice would come down. The city that had celebrated him as a genius on the way up would soon curse his name and send him death threats, because he was right. September was the peak. October was the turn. Through its first 3 weeks the market slid and rallied, each recovery a little weaker than the last. Margin calls began going out, not a flood yet, but a steady rain. The tape started running late on heavy days, an early symptom of a machine straining beyond its design. The end began on Thursday, the 24th of October, Black Thursday. From the opening bell, the selling came in waves that no one could explain and no one could stop. By 11 o'clock, the market was in freefall. Nearly 13 million shares would trade that day, 3 times a normal session. Crowds gathered on the steps of the exchange and across the street at the sub-treasury, silent mostly, which witnesses said was the eeriest part. Inside, the ticker fell hours behind the trading, so that a man selling at noon could not know what his shares had fetched until evening. Blindness added to panic. At midday, the great bankers of New York met at the offices of J.P. Morgan and Company and did what their fathers had done in the panic of 1907. They formed a pool and sent the exchange's vice president, Richard Whitney, onto the floor to bid loudly, theatrically, above the market price for U.S. steel. It was pure theater, and it was magnificent. The floor watched the most visible man on the exchange placing enormous buy orders on behalf of the mightiest banks in America, and the panic paused. The market steadied. The evening newspapers declared the worst was over, and for 2 days it seemed they were right. The worst had not begun. Over the weekend, something invisible and fatal happened. 100,000 kitchen table conversations. Families across America looked at the margin loans behind their holdings and decided, quietly, to get out on Monday. On Monday, the 28th of October, the Dow fell 13%, at the time, the worst single day ever recorded. And this time, the bankers' pool did not appear. The men at Morgan's had never intended to hold up the ocean. They had intended to steady a panic, and this was no longer a panic. It was a verdict. There would be no rescue. And then came Tuesday, the 29th of October, 1929. Black Tuesday, the single most devastating day in the history of American finance. 16 million shares changed hands, a volume so far beyond anything before it that the record stood for nearly 40 years. The margin machine was now running in full reverse. Every fall triggered calls, every call triggered selling, every sale triggered the next fall. Blocks of stock were thrown onto the market with no bid beneath them at any price. Fortunes that had taken lifetimes to build were unmade between breakfast and lunch. The great investment trusts, those halls of leveraged mirrors, shattered, some falling twice as fast as the stocks they held, because leverage works in reverse too. $14 billion of wealth vanished in that one session. In 2 months, the market lost more than America had spent fighting the entire First World War. A myth grew up afterwards of ruined speculators raining from window ledges. It largely did not happen, the historians have counted. What happened was quieter and worse. The savings of years, pledged as margin, silently transferred to the lenders, family by family, town by town. The Dow, which had touched 381 in September, closed November below 200. And here is the fact that separates 1929 from every ordinary crash. It did not stop. There were rallies, cruel ones. Through the spring of 1930, the market climbed steadily, recovering nearly half its losses, and the confident voices returned to say the storm had passed. President Hoover declared that the worst would be over within 60 days. Those who believed him, the brave, the loyal, the bargain hunters, bought back in. They were then carried down further than the original crash had taken anyone. Because now the financial wreck was infecting the real economy, through the one channel more dangerous than the stock exchange: the banks. American banks, thousands of them small, local, and unprotected, had lent against stocks, against Florida land, against crops whose prices were collapsing. When depositors doubted, they queued. When they queued, the bank fell, and there was no deposit insurance, so when the bank fell, every family's savings inside it fell too. In 1930, the queues began. In December of that year, the Bank of United States in New York failed with the deposits of 400,000 people, the largest bank failure in the nation's history. Over the following 3 years, some 9,000 American banks closed their doors. Credit vanished, factories closed, wages collapsed. Prices fell so far that farmers burned corn for heat because it was worth less than coal. And the market ground down, month after month, year after year. By the summer of 1932, the Dow Jones Industrial Average stood at 41 points. 41 from 381, an 89% fall. A dollar invested at the peak was worth 11 cents. The market would not see its 1929 high again for 25 years, not until 1954. A man who bought at the top at 30 would be past 50 before he broke even. What followed was the Great Depression, a decade in which a quarter of American workers had no work at all. Economists still argue carefully about how much of the depression the crash caused and how much it merely announced. But for the machinery of money, the verdict was immediate, and it was delivered in a marble hearing room in Washington. In 1933, a Senate committee under a former New York prosecutor named Ferdinand Pecora put the princes of Wall Street in the witness chair, under oath, in front of the newsreel cameras. Charles Mitchell of National City, the great bull evangelist, was made to explain how his bank had sold doomed bonds to its own depositors, and how he had arranged his affairs to pay no income tax at all in 1929. The head of J.P. Morgan itself admitted the same. Day after day, the public learned what the pools, the preferred lists, and the securities salesmen had actually been doing through the wonderful decade. The result was the great rebuilding, deposit insurance, so a bank run need never again wipe out a family's savings, the Glass-Steagall wall between banking and speculation. Margin limits set by law, pools and tape painting made federal crimes. And a new policeman for the markets, the Securities and Exchange Commission, whose first chairman in one of history's great ironies was Joseph Kennedy, the speculator who had heard the warning from a shoeshine boy. Set a thief to catch thieves, Roosevelt is supposed to have said. The individual fates tell the story in miniature. Irving Fisher, the prophet of the permanently high plateau, lost his fortune and his reputation together, and spent his remaining years explaining a crash he had not seen coming. Samuel Insull's pyramid collapsed with the savings of 600,000 investors inside it. He fled to Europe, was brought back to face trial, and remarkably was acquitted because what he had done when he did it had been legal. Richard Whitney, the hero of Black Thursday, 5 times president of the stock exchange, the very embodiment of the club's honor, was revealed in 1938 to have been an embezzler, stealing from his customers and even from the exchange's own fund for widows. He went to Sing Sing prison in handcuffs, while crowds gathered at the station to watch the passing of an era. And Jesse Livermore, the man who walked out of the crash with something like $100 million, perhaps the largest fortune ever taken from a single market event, found that even winning could not hold. Within 5 years, the fortune was gone again, lost to the same restless speculation that had built it. He was declared bankrupt for the 4th time in 1934 and did not live out the decade. The machine did not care who was clever, it only cared who was leveraged. So what should you take from 1929, nearly a century on? Take the machinery, not the melodrama. A market can detach from the economy beneath it for years, and the detachment can feel like genius while it lasts. Borrowed money turns every downturn into an avalanche. Leverage is the reason crashes are cliffs and not slopes. The rescue that works on Thursday can fail utterly by Monday, because confidence, once broken, does not answer to theater. The experts of the age can be exactly, catastrophically wrong at precisely the moment their confidence matters most, and the recovery that follows the first fall may be the most expensive trap of all. Above all, the 4 most expensive words in the English language remain the same ones spoken in every barber shop in 1929. This time it's different. The men are gone. The ticker tape is gone. The rules they wrote in 1933 have been bent, repealed in part, and rewritten. But the machine, belief, leverage, and the loop between them has been rebuilt in every generation since. It was running in 1987. It was running in 2000, and again in 2008. It is running now. Sources for this account include the records of the New York Stock Exchange, contemporary reporting from October and November 1929, Frederick Lewis Allen's Contemporary History, the Senate Banking Committee's Pecora investigation, and the price records of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, 1921 to 1954. On a single Monday in October of 1987, the American stock market lost almost a quarter of its entire value in the space of a few hours. Not over a year. Not over a week, in one trading day. It remains, to this day, the largest single-day percentage crash in the history of Wall Street, larger even than any single day of the Great Crash of 1929 that ushered in the Great Depression. And the strangest part of the whole affair is that, decades later, no one can fully agree on why it happened. This is the story of Black Monday, the day the market fell off a cliff for no reason anyone could name. It is a story about confidence and how quickly it can turn to terror. It is a story about clever machines, built to make finance safer, that instead chain themselves together into an engine of destruction. And it is a story about a single, quiet decision made in the hours after the crash that may have been the only thing standing between a bad day on Wall Street and a second Great Depression. To understand all of it, we have to start not with the fall, but with the long, intoxicating climb that came before it. The mid-1980s had been a golden age on Wall Street. The stock market had been rising, almost without interruption, for 5 years. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, the great barometer of American business, had more than tripled from its lows at the start of the decade. Fortunes were being made and made quickly. A new culture had taken hold in the great trading houses of New York, a culture of ambition, of excess, of absolute self-assurance. And a new generation of traders had risen with the market. Young, aggressive, hungry, they had come of age professionally during nothing but a rising market. Many of them had never, in their entire careers, lived through a serious crash. They had only ever known one direction: up. When a market has climbed for that long, a dangerous idea takes root in the collective mind. The idea that it will simply keep climbing, that the old rules of gravity have somehow been suspended, that this time is different. That belief, that comfortable and universal certainty, is almost always the precise setup for disaster. Because a market convinced it cannot fall is a market that has stopped pricing in the possibility that it might. It is worth understanding the particular flavor of that decade, because the mood of the 1980s was not just optimism. It was something closer to intoxication. This was the era of the corporate raider and the leveraged buyout, of financiers who borrowed staggering sums to swallow whole companies, of a culture that celebrated wealth and ambition with an openness America had not seen in generations. Money itself had become glamorous. The trading floors of Wall Street had become the most exciting place in the country for a certain kind of young and hungry mind. And the rewards for those who succeeded there were enormous and very public. A whole generation had been taught, by everything around them, that the market was a machine for making people rich, and that the only real mistake was to stand on the sidelines while others grew wealthy. When an entire society comes to believe that a rising market is simply the natural order of things, it stops asking the one question that matters most. What happens if it stops rising? By 1987, almost no one with real power on Wall Street was seriously asking that question, because to ask it was to seem old-fashioned, timid, out of step with a new and unstoppable age. And it is exactly in such moments, when doubt itself has come to seem foolish, that the ground is most dangerous underfoot. By the autumn of 1987, a few cracks had begun to appear in the confident surface. There were worries about the American economy. The dollar had been falling against other currencies, which unsettled foreign investors who held American assets. Interest rates, the cost of borrowing money, had been creeping upward through the year, and rising interest rates are a quiet enemy of a soaring stock market, because they make safer investments like bonds more attractive by comparison. And beneath it all lay a simple, nagging worry that the market had simply climbed too high, too fast, that prices had detached from the underlying reality of what companies were actually worth. In the week before Black Monday, that unease turned into the first real selling. Prices began to slide. The market fell on the Wednesday and again on the Thursday, and then on the Friday it fell hard, dropping over 4% in a single session. By the close of trading that Friday evening, a sense of dread had begun to settle over Wall Street. The confident mood of the summer was gone. Traders went home for the weekend anxious, watching, waiting. Something was coming, but no one, not the wisest veteran nor the most sophisticated computer, was prepared for what happened when the opening bell rang on Monday, the 19th of October. The selling began the moment the market opened, and it did not stop. Prices did not drift downward. They fell in a torrent, a cascade, a collapse. Wave after wave of sell orders crashed onto the exchange, overwhelming everything in their path. And to understand why the selling became so violent, so self-reinforcing, so utterly unstoppable, you have to understand something new that had entered the market in the 1980s. Something that had never existed in any previous crash. You have to understand the machines. For the first time in history, a great deal of the trading on Wall Street was no longer being done by human beings making individual decisions. It was being done by computers, following pre-programmed instructions, automatically, at a speed no human could match. This was known as program trading, and one particular strategy, built on top of it, would turn out to be at the very heart of the catastrophe. It was called portfolio insurance. The idea behind portfolio insurance sounded not just sensible, but clever. It was a way, its creators promised, to protect a large investment portfolio against a falling market. The mechanism was simple. Computer programs would monitor the market constantly, and if prices fell past a certain level, the programs would automatically sell, moving money out of stocks to limit any further losses. In theory, it was a seatbelt for your investments. If the market started to crash, the machine would get you out before you were badly hurt. Enormous institutions, managing billions of dollars in pension funds and investments, had adopted this strategy. It felt like prudence. It felt like safety. But now consider what happens when a great many of the most powerful players in the entire market are all running the same automatic strategy at the same time. Consider the logic of it, followed to its conclusion. Prices begin to fall. The computers, exactly as they were instructed, begin to sell. But all of that selling, all those billions of dollars of stock being dumped onto the market at once, pushes prices down even further. And the lower prices trigger the programs to sell yet more, which pushes prices lower still, which triggers more selling. Do you see the trap? A tool that had been designed to protect against a fall had quietly transformed into an engine that manufactured one. The seatbelt had become the crash. Every wave of automated selling drove the price down, and every drop in the price commanded the machines to unleash the next wave of selling, in a spiral that fed upon itself, faster and faster, with a cold mechanical logic that no single human being had chosen, and that no single human being could easily stop. It was a machine, in effect, eating itself alive. The very systems built to make the market safer had, without anyone quite realizing it, wired themselves together into a doomsday device. And on that Monday morning, the market fell far enough to pull the trigger, and the whole vast apparatus began to run away. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the scene was one of mounting chaos and disbelief. The men and women whose job it was to match buyers with sellers, the specialists, were being buried alive under an avalanche of sell orders with almost no buyers on the other side. For many stocks, there was simply no one willing to buy at any price that anyone was willing to accept. Prices gapped downward in sickening lurches. The machinery of the exchange, the phones and the order systems, strained, and in places broke under a volume of trading it had never been built to handle. There was another dimension to the disaster, one that unfolded not in New York but nearly 1,000 miles away, in Chicago. For in Chicago traded a newer kind of instrument, the stock index future, a contract whose value was tied to the level of the market as a whole. In theory, the price of those futures in Chicago and the price of the actual stocks in New York should move in perfect lockstep, tied together by traders who profit from any gap between them. But on Black Monday, the selling was so violent, and the two markets fell so fast and so unevenly, that the link between them broke. The futures in Chicago plunged even faster than the stocks in New York, and the yawning gap that opened between them sent its own terrifying signal. To anyone watching the Chicago screens, it looked as though the market was worth even less than the already catastrophic prices in New York suggested. That signal fed straight back into the panic, telling the portfolio insurance programs to sell yet more, driving the New York market down to catch up with the collapse in Chicago. The two great marketplaces, meant to steady one another, had instead begun to drag each other into the abyss, each new low in one market justifying and demanding a new low in the other. It was the same self-feeding spiral, now operating not just within a single exchange but between two of them, across the whole width of the country. And beneath the failing machines was the oldest force in all of finance, raw human panic. As the traders on the floor watched the numbers on their screens collapse at a speed they had never witnessed and could barely comprehend, the confident certainty of the boom years shattered in an afternoon. Fear took hold, and fear is contagious. People sold because prices were falling, and prices fell because people were selling. The most ancient and most destructive feedback loop in the whole of economic history, now supercharged and accelerated by the cold speed of the computers. By the time the closing bell finally, mercifully rang, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had fallen by nearly 23%. In a single day, close to a quarter of the accumulated value of corporate America had simply ceased to exist. It is worth pausing to remember that those numbers on the screens were not abstractions. Behind them stood real people. There were the professional traders, of course, some of whom saw their firms and their careers destroyed in the space of that single afternoon, walking out onto the streets of Manhattan that evening in a daze, unable quite to believe what they had witnessed. But behind them stood millions of ordinary Americans, people who had never set foot on a trading floor, whose pensions and retirement savings were invested, quietly and for the long term, in that same market. For them, Black Monday was a number on the evening news that meant a portion of their future security had, on paper at least, vanished while they were at work. The great lesson many of them drew, the ones who did not panic and sell at the bottom, was one of the most valuable in all of investing. That for the patient, a crash is not the end of the story. Those who held their nerve, who did not sell into the panic, saw their savings recover within a couple of years and grow for decades afterward. Those who sold in terror at the bottom locked in their losses forever. The crash, in the end, transferred a great deal of wealth, not so much from the poor to the rich, as from the fearful to the patient. Now here is the crucial question, the one that has puzzled economists and historians ever since. What actually caused it? What was the trigger? And the answer, the deeply unsettling answer, is that there was no single cause out in the world. There had been no war declared that morning. No president had been assassinated. No great bank had announced its collapse. There was no single piece of catastrophic news large enough to explain a fall of that magnitude. The worries that existed about the dollar and interest rates were real, but they were ordinary. They were the kind of worries markets absorb all the time without falling 23% in a day. And that absence of a clear external cause is, in the end, the most revealing and the most frightening thing about the entire event, because it tells us that the real culprit was not out in the world at all. The real culprit was inside the market itself. The crash was not caused by some external shock. It was generated internally by the very structure of the modern market, by the interaction of automated trading, of panic, and of a crowd that had convinced itself of something that was not true. The system did not break because it was hit from outside. It broke because of the way it had been built. It is only fair to say that economists have argued about this ever since, and the argument has never been fully settled. Some insist that portfolio insurance and program trading were the true villains, the accelerant that turned an ordinary decline into a historic collapse. Others argue that the machines were not the cause but merely the mechanism, that the market was overvalued and had to fall, and that if the computers had not driven the selling, human panic would have done the job anyway. Still others point to the breakdown between Chicago and New York, or to the failures of the exchanges' own overwhelmed systems. The honest answer is that it was almost certainly all of these things at once, feeding on one another. And that uncertainty is itself the point. A market simple enough to be fully understood is a market simple enough to be made safe. But the market of 1987 had grown too complex, too fast, too interconnected for anyone to hold the whole of it in their mind at once. No single person understood how all the pieces would behave together under extreme stress, because no one had ever seen them tested that way before. The crash was, in a sense, the market discovering its own hidden design in the most violent way imaginable. And every financial crisis since has carried that same signature, a system so intricate that its own builders could not foresee the way it would fail. But the story of Black Monday does not end at the closing bell. In many ways, the most dangerous moment was still to come, and it came not on the Monday, but in the terrifying hours that followed. Because a stock market crash is not only about prices falling, it is about the intricate web of trust and credit that holds the entire financial system together. And on the night of the 19th and the morning of the 20th of October, that web came within a hair's breadth of tearing apart completely. When markets fall that far, that fast, the firms that make their living trading them can face sudden and enormous demands for cash, demands to settle their trades and cover their losses. On that Tuesday morning, some of the most important firms on Wall Street were staring into an abyss, uncertain whether they had the cash to meet their obligations. The banks that normally lent them money, frightened by the chaos, grew reluctant to lend at all. And if the credit that oiled the machinery of Wall Street were to freeze, if firm after firm were to fail because no one would lend, then the crash of Monday could cascade into something far worse. A collapse not just of prices, but of the financial system itself. This is the moment that separated 1987 from 1929. Because in the crash of 1929, the people in charge had, in large part, stood back. They had allowed the panic to spread, allowed banks to fail in their thousands, allowed the money supply to collapse, and in doing so had helped turn a stock market crash into a decade-long Great Depression that scarred the entire world. The lesson of that catastrophe had been studied, agonized over, and learned by the generation that followed. And so, in October of 1987, the head of America's central bank, the Federal Reserve, a man named Alan Greenspan who had been in the job for only a matter of weeks, made a decision. Before the market opened on that Tuesday morning, the Federal Reserve issued a statement. It was short. It was, in the language of central banking, extraordinary. It affirmed, in essence, that the central bank stood ready to serve as a source of liquidity to support the economic and financial system. In plain words, the Federal Reserve was promising to provide whatever money the banks and the financial system needed to keep functioning. It was throwing a safety net under the entire structure and telling everyone loudly that the net was there. And behind the words came the actions. The Federal Reserve made sure the money flowed. It leaned on the banks to keep lending to the trading firms that needed it. It flooded the system with the cash required to keep the machinery from seizing up. It was a deliberate, decisive intervention, born directly from the hard lessons of 1929, and its purpose was singular: to stop the panic before the panic could feed on itself and consume everything. And it worked. Starved of the fuel of frozen credit and collapsing confidence, the panic began to subside. The market, which had opened Tuesday still lurching and terrified, steadied. Buyers, sensing that the floor would hold, began cautiously to return. The immediate crisis, the one that could have turned Black Monday into a genuine catastrophe, passed. And then, over the following weeks and months, something remarkable happened. The market began to recover. It climbed slowly at first, then with more confidence. And within around 2 years, the losses of that single terrible Monday had been entirely made back. The cliff, it turned out, had a bottom, and a hand had reached down to help the market climb back up it. It is worth pausing to note that Black Monday was not only an American event. In our connected world, the panic spread across the globe with the speed of the telephone and the trading terminal. Markets in Hong Kong, in London, in Australia, and across Europe fell sharply in the same period, some of them even further than New York. It was a vivid early demonstration of a truth that would define the decades to come. That in a globalized financial system, fear does not respect borders. A panic that begins on Wall Street can circle the entire planet before the sun has set. In the aftermath, as the shock wore off, the investigations began, and they pointed, again and again, at the role of the machines, at program trading and portfolio insurance, at the way automated selling had amplified and accelerated the fall. The response was a set of reforms designed to put brakes on the runaway engine. Chief among them were what came to be known as circuit breakers, automatic halts that would pause trading entirely if the market fell too far, too fast. The idea was simple and humane. If the machinery starts to run away, stop it. Force everyone to take a breath. Give the panic a moment to cool before it can complete its work. Those circuit breakers remain in place, in one form or another to this day, a permanent monument to the lessons of Black Monday. And yet, for all the reforms, the deepest pattern of Black Monday has never really gone away. It has only changed its clothing. Look at the great financial dramas of the decades that followed, and you find the same fingerprints again and again. In the crash of 2008, it was not portfolio insurance, but a tangle of mortgage-backed securities and derivatives so complex that even the banks that built them did not fully understand what they held, until the whole structure buckled and nearly took the world economy down with it. In the strange event of 2010 that came to be known as the flash crash, the American market plunged and then recovered almost 1,000 points in a matter of minutes, driven by automated trading algorithms reacting to one another at speeds no human could follow, a miniature Black Monday compressed into the space of a coffee break. Each time, the specific machinery was new. Each time, the underlying story was old. A financial system grown so intricate and so fast that it could generate its own disasters from the inside, without any villain, without any warning, simply through the interaction of its own clever parts under stress. Black Monday was the first time the modern world saw that pattern clearly, the first time it understood that the greatest danger in finance might no longer be a war or a famine or a failed harvest, but the very complexity of the machine it had built to manage its own wealth. In that sense, every automated sell-off since has been an echo of that October Monday, a reminder that we have never quite escaped the trap we first stumbled into in 1987. We have only, each time, built a faster and more elaborate version of it, and then acted surprised when it sprang. So what, in the end, are we to take from that extraordinary day? There are two lessons, and they pull in opposite directions, which is precisely why the event remains so haunting and so instructive. The first lesson is a warning, and it is a dark one. The more complex, the more automated, the more interconnected a financial system becomes, the more it becomes capable of failing in sudden, violent, and unforeseeable ways. The machines that were built to reduce risk did not eliminate it. They concentrated it, and they hid it, and they linked it together, until it all burst out at once in a single catastrophic afternoon. Complexity, we learned, does not remove danger from a system. Very often it simply conceals that danger, drives it beneath the surface, and stores it up for the worst possible moment. Every generation builds new and cleverer financial machinery, and every generation is tempted to believe that this time the machinery has finally tamed the risk. Black Monday whispers that it never quite has. But the second lesson is more hopeful, and it matters just as much. A crash, however terrifying, is not the same thing as a catastrophe. The fall itself does not determine the outcome. What determines the outcome is what happens next. What turned the crash of 1929 into the Great Depression was, in large part, a failure of will, a failure to act, a decision to stand back and let the fire burn. What kept the crash of 1987 from becoming a second depression was the opposite. A swift, confident, and deliberate response, a clear signal to a terrified market that someone was in control, that the system would be supported, and that it would not be allowed to collapse. The difference between a very bad day and a lost decade often comes down, in the end, to the courage and the wisdom of the people in charge in the hours that follow the fall. Black Monday remains a kind of ghost story on Wall Street, told and retold across the generations. The day the market fell nearly a quarter for no reason anyone could name, brought down not by any villain or any disaster, but by its own clever machinery and by the timeless terror of the crowd. It is a reminder that beneath the confident, rational surface of modern finance there runs, always, a deep current of pure human fear, and that the sophisticated tools we build to master that fear can, under the right conditions, turn upon us and master us instead. A quarter of the market, gone in an afternoon. No villain to blame but the machine and the crowd and ourselves. And a single, quiet decision made in the hours that followed, that made all the difference in the world. Sources for this account include contemporary reporting on the crash of the 19th of October, 1987, the official inquiries that followed into the role of program trading and portfolio insurance, notably the report of the Presidential Task Force on Market Mechanisms, and the widely documented response of the Federal Reserve in the days after Black Monday. On the 10th of March, in the year 2000, the Nasdaq Stock Exchange closed at 5,048 points, the highest it had ever been. The financial channels celebrated. The magazines declared a new economy. Millions of ordinary Americans checked their portfolios that weekend and felt, perhaps for the first time in their lives, rich. Within 31 months, 78% of that value was gone. $5 trillion, more than the annual economic output of Japan, had simply evaporated. Companies worth billions on a Friday were worthless by the following spring, and the index that touched 5,000 would not see that number again for 15 years. They called it the dot-com bubble, and it remains the strangest crash in American history because the believers were right. The internet really did change everything. The technology was real. The revolution was real. And almost everyone who invested in it lost almost everything anyway. This is the story of how that happened, not the myth, the machinery, because the dot-com bubble was not built by fools. It was built by intelligent people acting on a true idea, and it destroyed them anyway. That is what makes it the most instructive crash of them all. To understand the mania, you have to understand the moment it began. And it began, by most accounts, on a single day in August of 1995. A small company from California called Netscape made a piece of software for browsing something most Americans had barely heard of, the World Wide Web. Netscape had never made a profit. It was 16 months old, and on the 9th of August 1995, it sold shares to the public for the first time. The shares were priced at $28. They opened at $71. By the end of the first day's trading, a profitless software company barely a year old was worth more than $2 billion. Wall Street looked at that number and understood something profound had shifted. The old rules said a company earned profits first and rewarded shareholders second. Netscape proved the market would no longer wait. A story about the future could be sold today, at any price the future might justify. Every machine needs fuel. The fuel of the 20s was margin debt. The fuel of the 90s was the story, and the story was magnificent. Because the story was true, the internet genuinely was rewiring commerce, communication, entertainment, everything. Anyone could see it. The number of Americans online was doubling at a rate no industry had ever recorded. And into that truth, the machinery poured. Here is how the machine worked. A handful of young companies, a bookstore with no shops, an auction house with no premises, showed that a website could reach every customer in America at once. Venture capital firms who fund companies before they reach the stock market drew the obvious conclusion: whoever claimed each territory of the internet first would own it forever. Books, pets, groceries, toys, land grab now, profits later. So the venture firms funded everything. In 1999 alone, they poured over $50 billion into internet startups, 6 times what they had invested just 3 years earlier. Speed mattered more than sense. A business plan written on a napkin could raise millions if the napkin had .com written on it. And the companies spent it, not on building profits, but on being noticed. In January 2000, 17 separate .com companies each paid over $2 million for 30 seconds of advertising during the Super Bowl. Companies that had never earned $1 were burning millions a month on television commercials, free delivery, and sock puppets. There was even a new language to justify it. Profits were old economy. The new economy measured eyeballs, how many people visited your website. Burn rate, how fast you spent your investors' money, was worn as a badge of ambition. Get big fast. Profitability was always 2 years away for everyone forever. Then came the second stage of the machine, the stock market itself. The initial public offering, the IPO, became a product line. In 1999, 457 companies went public in America, most of them internet companies, most of them unprofitable. On their first day of trading, over 100 of them doubled. Buying shares in a company on the morning of its IPO and selling them by the afternoon became the closest thing to free money American markets had ever offered. And who told the public which stocks to buy? The analysts, and this is where the machine becomes a scandal. Stock analysts at the great investment banks were meant to be referees, independent judges of what a company was worth. But the banks earned their real fees from taking companies public. A bank whose analysts said .com stocks were overpriced did not win .com clients, so the referees joined the team. The most famous was a former journalist named Henry Blodgett. In December 1998, as a young analyst, he predicted that Amazon, then trading around $240, would reach $400 within a year. The old guard laughed. It took 3 weeks. The call made him a star, and his pronouncements could move billions of dollars by lunchtime. Years later, investigators would publish what the analysts wrote to each other in private while telling the public to buy. Stocks they recommended in the morning were described in internal emails, in language we cannot repeat here, as junk and worse. The referees were not just on the team, they knew. And the public bought. This was the first crash of the online age, and the crowd had a new toy, the discount internet broker. By the end of the 90s, millions of Americans had trading accounts they could operate from their desks at work. A new species appeared, the day trader, buying and selling technology stocks by the hour. Office workers quit their jobs to trade full-time. The financial channel CNBC played in gyms and airport lounges like sports coverage. The shoeshine boys of 1929 had become an entire connected nation, and every one of them could act on the tip instantly. Qualcomm, a telecommunications company, rose 2,600% in 1999 alone. In March 2000, Cisco, the company that made the internet's plumbing, briefly became the most valuable company on Earth, worth more than $500 billion. The market wasn't pricing businesses anymore. It was pricing the future itself, and the future had no ceiling. Not everyone believed, and once again, the doubters are the most instructive part of the story. The first warning came from the most powerful financial voice on the planet. In December of 1996, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, asked a question in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable speech. How do we know, he wondered aloud, when irrational exuberance has unduly escalated asset values? 2 words, irrational exuberance, flashed around the world's markets. Tokyo fell. London fell. New York opened down sharply. And then, having flinched, the market did what late-stage manias always do. It decided the warning was wrong. The Nasdaq more than tripled after the speech. Every investor who sold on Greenspan's words watched from the sidelines as their neighbors got richer for 3 more years. The lesson everyone learned was the most dangerous lesson a market can teach. The man who warns you is the fool. By 1999, the skeptics were in open retreat. Fund managers who refused to buy internet stocks trailed their rivals so badly that clients deserted them. One of the most respected value investors in Britain, Tony Dye, was nicknamed Dr. Doom and lost his job in February 2000 days, as it turned out, before the top. Being right early in a mania is indistinguishable from being wrong. The end, when it came, had no single dramatic day. No Black Tuesday. The dot-com bubble did not burst so much as deflate, a long hiss that lasted 2.5 years. The peak was Friday, the 10th of March, 2000, 5,048. The following week, a financial magazine called Barron's published a cover story with a simple piece of arithmetic. Its reporters had studied 200 internet companies and calculated how many months of cash each had left at its current burn rate. The answer, for a quarter of them, less than 12. The article was titled Burning Up. The magic phrase "profits later" suddenly had a date attached, and the date was soon. In April, the Nasdaq fell 25% in a single week. The IPO window slammed shut, and that mattered more than any headline, because the entire machine ran on new money. Companies with 11 months of cash and no path to profit now had no one left to sell shares to. The music had not paused, it had ended. Then came the die-off, company by company, through 2000 and 2001. Petscom, the one with the sock puppet mascot the whole country recognized, went public in February 2000 and was liquidated before the year ended. 9 months, beginning to end. Webvan, an online grocer that had built a network of automated warehouses, burned through more than $800 million and collapsed. eToys, whose share price had once made it worth more than the toy company Toys R Us, which sold actual toys in actual shops at an actual profit, was gone by the spring of 2001. A website that did nothing but chronicle the funerals became popular reading. It rarely lacked material. The infection spread beyond the startups. The telecom companies that had borrowed fortunes to lay fiber optic cable for the coming internet age found they had built decades of capacity for demand that was years away. Some of the largest of them collapsed into bankruptcy and fraud investigations that would dwarf the dot-coms. And the giants were not spared. Cisco, briefly the most valuable company alive, lost more than 80%. Amazon, a real company with real customers and a real future, fell from $107 a share to $6. 94% gone. The market was no longer distinguishing between the fake and the real. In a crash, it never does. By the 9th of October 2002, the Nasdaq closed at 1,114, 78% below the peak. $5 trillion of paper wealth had been erased. The retirement accounts of a generation of ordinary Americans, teachers, engineers, the day traders who had quit their jobs, bore the losses. The index would not reclaim 5,000 until the year 2015. The reckoning, as always, came after the money was gone. The Attorney General of New York, Eliot Spitzer, subpoenaed the private emails of Wall Street's analysts and published them. The gap between what the referees said in public and wrote in private was so indefensible that 10 of the largest investment banks paid nearly $1.5 billion to settle, and the rules were rewritten to wall analysts off from the bankers whose deals they had been cheering. Henry Blodgett, the man who called Amazon at 400, was charged with securities fraud, paid $4 million, and was banned from the industry for life. The sock puppet outlived the analysts. But here is the strange ending, the thing that separates 2000 from 1929, and the reason this crash still confuses people. The believers were right. Online shopping did conquer retail. The eyeballs did turn into money. Almost every wild claim made in 1999 came true, just 5 to 10 years late, and mostly for companies that survived the winter. Amazon, the 94% loser, recovered to become one of the most valuable enterprises in human history. Google, founded in the bubble's final years, built an empire on the cheap fiber optic cable the bankrupt telecoms left behind. The infrastructure the mania paid for became the foundation of the modern world. Which leaves us with the two most expensive lessons in modern investing. First, a revolution can be real and still ruin you. Being right about the technology is not the same as being right about the price. The railway investors of the 1840s learned it. The internet investors of 2000 relearned it. The next generation, whatever its revolution is called, will learn it again. And second, the machine was the same machine. A true story told without limits. New money required to keep prices rising. Referees paid by the players. A public converted at the very top. Change the costumes, margin clerks to day traders, ticker tape to stock tickers on television, and 2000 was 1929 at a higher resolution. The pattern did not die, it upgraded. Somewhere tonight, a genuinely revolutionary technology is being priced as if the future has no ceiling. The technology will probably succeed. That is not the same question as whether you will. Sources for this account include Nasdaq closing records from 1995 to 2015, the Barron's cover investigation of March 2000, the published findings and settlement of the 2003 Global Analyst Research Settlement, and contemporary reporting from the financial press on both sides of the peak.